paying attention to the things that you do, and it doesn't matter what they are. It really doesn't. Like the things you do that give you that little bit of like feeling of excitement, that lift you out of your seat, that give you the kind of like swirly feeling inside of you where you feel like you had a giant cup of coffee or something, but it's like a cosmic cup of coffee, where you're like, I just got this blast of energy like this. The tragic thing is that a lot of people feel guilty about feeling that good. So they're like, oh, I like to do this thing. It could be gardening, maybe it's podcasting, maybe it's painting. I don't know what it is, but they do a thing. It could be, I don't know, running, like whatever it is. They do a thing and they're like, oh, I love this so much. I better not do it too much because I'm guilty to feel that feeling all the time. It's like you should be focusing on that feeling. And that's what I invite people to do.
Hey friends, welcome to The Good Life with Michele Lamoureux, a show for women in midlife who want to live happier, healthier, and more meaningful lives. I'm your host, Michele Lamoureux, a self-love coach and the author of Design a Life You Love. And together we're going to be doing just that. Each week I bring on world-class experts, best-selling authors, leading entrepreneurs, and also do solo casts with the intention of inviting you to get connected to what you really desire from your life. This show is produced with love every week. There's inspiration and actionable tips in every episode because I want to see women playing a starring role in their lives instead of living on the sidelines. Be sure to join the Good Life community newsletter over at thegoodlifecoach.com for more inspiration and tips to live your best midlife. And make sure you're following the show on your favorite podcast player. I'm so glad that you're here. Hey friends, it's Michele Lamoureux and welcome back. Today on the show, we're talking about how to live the life that you desire. Joining us today is Cory Allen, who's the author of a new book called Brave New You. It's a beautiful book that helps guide us to creating that life that our intuition is trying to bring us back to, that our inner knowing is trying to lead us to, that our soul wants us to remember, but we get off path and we settle or we get stuck. And he's going to share very specific things that we can do, including how to let go of those feelings of unworthiness, which may be keeping you from taking action. Cory is an author. He's a podcast host and influencer from Austin. And he writes daily thoughts on mindfulness and mental clarity, reaching over 1 million people a week. And you may already be following him. And if you are, you'll know why I'm so excited that he's on today. And if you're new to his work, definitely pick up a copy of his book and follow him on Instagram. He always seems to write just the thing you need to hear. He's just a beautiful writer and person. All of the show notes for today are right on your podcast player. All the resources we mentioned will be there, including a link to Cory's book and a link to join my community and sign up for the weekly newsletter, which I'd love to have you be a part of. So on that note, let's get into the show. Here we go. So Cory, I love your new book. I feel like your voice is a gift to the world, both like the resonance in terms of the actual sound that comes out. You have a really unique, beautiful voice. I'm sure people tell you that all the time. It's perfect for meditation because you can take people and they feel safe. I know I feel that way. And the words that move through you to your followers through your writing is also so resonant and beautiful. And I just want to say thank you for that. It's such a gift that you have.
Well, thank you. I love this podcast.
Oh, good. Let's just talk about what we love about Cory.
No, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's a good combo, and I like that you started off talking about, before we started recording, you're talking about the, where the voice comes from, and just sort of observing and paying attention in myself. It's interesting to, understand like where the intention and the feeling and all that stuff, that's kind of how I became aware of that, is because it's something that I focus on. And so I appreciate you noticing that.
Yeah. And with your music, I know you produced music too, but did you sing as well? I wasn't clear about that from the book. Are you a singer?
No, no, but I think I might have missed my calling. I don't know.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Like, have you ever explored singing?
No, I don't. I played a lot of instruments. I can
Yeah.
play, guitar. I can do some kind of experimental things on piano. I'm really good at synthesizers, like my weird experimental electronic instruments.
Yeah.
Um, but whenever I go to sing, it does not work out. I think it's because my voice is so monotone. I'm
That's so
so
funny.
just locked into one. Yeah, so I can hear pitches really, really well, but I
Yes.
can't reproduce them with melodically. I think also it's because I'm not big on melodies. That's the other. I think that could be what it is too. Is any of my music is not just um it's a lot of droning, a lot of long sustained notes, and I suppose not surprisingly, that's what my voice sounds like,
It's so
long
funny.
sustained.
I love this. I love discovering more. And also, you like we were talking about the art, like very simple and, clean. And it's maybe just part of your energy. You're very true to
Yeah.
yourself, even when it comes to voice. So your first book came out in 2019. Now is the way. So what
Mhm.
inspired you to write your latest book, Brave New You? And who did you hope it was going to reach?
Yeah, I suppose I wanted to reach everyone that I was reaching on social media. Um, and what really inspired me was like reaching like about 1 million people a week through the writing I put out into the world. Um, I I am fascinated with perception, and like whenever I start looking at how people are responding to the stuff I'm putting out there, I start thinking like, okay, I think I know what, might be useful for people. But then I stop and I think, well, this is my perception of what I think these people need. Let me like study this a bit more deeply and see objectively what is really needed out in the world. And so I started paying really close attention to comments, engagements, like DMs that I get, just all of the stuff, like what things I'm putting out there are really thriving, which means that
Yeah.
it's really connecting with people and why. And um, I do a lot of like putting my mind in the mind of the prospect. Like I do this with
Mm,
everything.
okay.
And this could be something we could talk about in a minute because it's I find it interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but really, so I started just paying attention, like, all right, what is the kind of cultural resonance? What's happening? What are people looking for? And I started just taking notes and really studying this. And the thing that surprised me that seemed to be the most consistent was that they have this feeling that they want to change and they feel like that change, whether it be large or small, is
Yeah.
right out of their grasp. They can't quite find the road to get from A to B. And I thought about that deeply of like, what is it that's really holding a person back from that?
Yes.
And ultimately, just at a very high level view, I believe it's that a person, we all get so, I'm going to say high level, I'm not going to give you like a 4 minute answer. But
Go
um,
for it.
we all get so used to the patterns in which we live and think in.
Yes.
And it happens gradually because as we are developing into adults, no one is teaching us how to be self aware and pay attention to what's going on. And
Yes.
so ultimately, we're just reacting to everything that we're experiencing in life. And the patterns of our identity and our behaviors and our thinking habits all take shape on their own. And since they take shape on our own, at a certain point, if we are lucky enough to become more self aware, we
Yes.
look at what's happening in life and we think, oh, well, this is just what is because it's what we're used to. It's because it's what happened to have happened. And so that really limits people because they're like, oh, well, I guess, this is what I'm capable of. This is all I deserve. This is all I can do. And so those negative thinking habits, those patterns keep them from thinking in different ways because they just are, the kind of settled with what's happening. And so that's why the first part of the book starts off with really doing some mental house cleaning and like identifying, because that's one of the big issues. Like awareness, self-awareness is everything with growth,
Yes.
because if you don't know what you're looking for, you can never work with it, right? So, pointing out all of these mental thinking habits that everyone suffers from, which would be, overthinking, imposter syndrome, making assumptions about reality, making, believing the stories that you're creating based out of fear or any of these things. And I show people very practically and in a detailed way how to recognize those patterns, what they look like in life, and then steps in which how to work with them and let them go. And once you release and start to work and recognize those patterns, then you open up into seeing more potential and also, most importantly, being able to hear your inner voice. Once you get out of that reactive state of living and thinking, then you start to hear what's going on inside. And as you then are able to choose one simple thing, it's not like I'm going to start a Fortune 500 company. It's like maybe I don't feel so great about myself. Maybe I'll buy some new clothes and I'll try and that'll make me feel better. I'll feel a little sharper with something new and fresh. And you go and you do that. And then you realize, like, actually, hold on a second. I noticed something that I didn't feel good about. I identified it. I took action to change that. And now I feel better. Now maybe I can do more of this. And it develops this feedback loop of listening to what you need, what's arising in your own inner voice, and then having the confidence and the self trust to turn that into reality. And that process just builds and builds and builds until you're doing these huge things. And what's really interesting about it is that once you get to the place where you're doing these huge things, they don't really seem huge anymore.
Yeah.
They're just more because it's a process of observing, self trust, and listening and taking action and just having a plan. And so that's ultimately how I guide people. And there's a lot more in there in the book, of course, that people need along the way. And really, I'm trying to. Um, I want people to feel the way that I feel. I want to give them the map that I went through and kind of the things that I experienced to get to feeling how I feel now. And that's why there's a lot of things stuck in. I don't know. I assume it makes sense to someone else outside, but I will be talking about, throughout the book. It's like, here's all these mental thinking habits. Here's a reinvigorating thing to not settle, to recognize this new territory, to get, inspired by what's possible in your life. But then I'll put in stuff like, and by the way, don't go around trying to convert everyone to your way of thinking. Like there's
Mhm.
reasons I stuck that stuff in there, or like here is how you deal with tension, here's how you deal with anxiety, because like as the mind becomes more online and this whole thing unfolds, there are just these certain sort of pitfalls and challenges that are fundamentally human that
Yes.
we run into, which I ran into and had to figure out my path through. And so I just lay this all out. So I'm like, all right, now this person's going to end up feeling this. So here's the answer. And then they'll feel this. And so here's what you
You've been
do.
there.
Yeah, exactly.
But I
Exactly.
think that's why it's such a gift because it's relatable. Like everything you talk about in the book is so relatable. And things that you're not even aware that you do once you see it on the paper and like you explain it, you're like, oh, yeah, that's my pattern. Like I think you were talking about in social situations over like, what was the word you use? Is it not projecting, but like just
No, overperforming your personality.
overperforming? I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I think I fall into that sometimes. And it's like, I think the goal, the reason I even started the show was to get people connected to their inner knowings and to live the life they came to live. I don't want my shows for women. I don't want any woman at the end of her life looking back and thinking, gosh, I lived for everyone else. I had those dreams and I'm never going to see them realized. There's a few things I want to unpack from what you
Right.
said. And you write in the book, and it's funny. So when I found your work, Cory, what was interesting was that I found you on Instagram, probably like millions of people that follow you every week. Um, and I don't normally reshare stuff, but like what you said, everything you write, it's like you're in my head. I'm like, oh my God, that's so wise. Like, and I would share it usually with like a
Yeah.
little, like one of those little hearts, like, or love this, like put it on my
Yeah.
page. And so when I was reading your book, it's funny because usually if I read a a guest book, I'll pull like maybe one thing out that resonated. And then I found myself doing the same thing with your book, like the Instagram, where I was like, oh my God, this is genius. I got to read this. I got to read this. And so I changed my notes a bit, but I do want to read this because I think this is setting the tone for what you literally just talked about. You wrote, I'm incredibly grateful to share with you everything that's helped me transform my life. I often reflect on what my perspective was like years ago before I started mentoring, writing, and speaking about this inner work. I remember back to when I truly believed that all my negative thoughts defined who I was, that my mental tension was a part of me, and that redefining the future may have been possible for others, but it certainly wasn't possible for me. I reflect on that outlook because it keeps me inspired. Contrasting it with how I feel today is mind blowing. It's like two different lives. And I think that's both the invitation and the challenge because I think people are stuck because when you have the self-awareness and you're like, "Oh wait, I've been living a good enough life, but actually I do have these dreams. I can feel my gifts calling me, but I'm like stuck in my safe world and I don't know how to get that momentum."
Yeah.
So how do we start taking some of those steps? And I think those negative thoughts are part of the problem, like a big part of the problem.
Hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for reading that. And it's interesting to hear you read that because I was listening to you read it and I was like, that sounds really beautiful and touching, you know?
You
But
wrote
it's funny
it.
that whenever you're out of, yeah, just like whenever something you create is outside of you, it
Yes.
feels so different.
Yes, true.
Yeah, I think that like getting an understanding of what the unknown actually is and what it feels like and why it feels scary. That's why I paint that picture in there about, not only on an emotional level of why we are kind of scared to move into unknown territory where we will grow and have those breakthroughs, but I also touch on, an evolutionary psychology reason of like from a science-based reason why we feel this fear,
Right.
because I like to touch on here's some kind of philosophical thoughts about it. Here's some science of like what's actually happening in your body, and then
Yes.
here's how to work it. Here's what you do.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and so, yeah, like the just to play around with that area real quick, like, whenever we go to make some type of advancement, like say someone listening wants to start their own podcast, they want to, be a professional podcaster, maybe they want to write a book, maybe they want to start a social media page or something like that and put a lot of effort into it. But generally, what happens is the first thing after inspiration, and this is always interesting to me, is the
Yes.
person feels inspiration and then they feel the blockage. So they
Yes.
go like, "Oh, maybe I should do this," and then the resistance hits. So
Yes.
interesting how that happens. And ultimately, what's happening there is I've thought about this just living my entire life being a creative person and just putting out music and writing and everything is I just watched this process unfold in myself over and over. And I was like, okay, what's happening here? I need to like really observe that deeply and understand this. And so basically it's like the inspiration is you getting this flash of, you know, ultimately it's these elements of your subconscious clicking together because you saw something, you observed something that excited you, and you're like, oh, that's the thing. And that feeling, that exciting feeling, whenever I talk about like pay attention to the things that make you feel alive, that's what I'm talking about, is whenever you get that little extra lift in your seat where you're just like, ooh, I want to do that. That sounds so exciting. Like, so that's the inspiration. And then we're like, okay, well, let's actually make this become a reality. Let's put this into play. Then we feel the fear and the barrier. And then most people, they will have some type of intrusive negative thought. The barrier turns into the intrusive thought. So it's, oh, well, look, there's too many podcasts out there already, or you're not good enough, or no one's going to want to come on, or what are you thinking? Like, or it'll use practical reasons, like, well, it can be tough to make a living doing that, like whatever. So then people go, all right, well, horrible voice in my head. You're probably right. I'll go back to the safe space and not, whatever.
Yes.
So what happens there is like ultimately, um, in the same way that like whenever we're standing next to a river, and I talk about this in the book, or we could be standing at the edge of a building or something, we feel a physical sense of fear. It's like a magnet pushing against us. And that feeling is a animal sense of danger and vulnerability. It's the vulnerability because if we were to go into the raging river, we would become vulnerable and we would lose control and possibly get hurt or die. If we
Yes.
were to look over the edge of the building too far, we could slip, we could fall. Obviously, if you're falling, you're very vulnerable, maximum vulnerability, and then you die. So that is what that is
Stakes are
programmed.
high.
Yeah, stakes are very high if you're falling through the areas.
No wonder we don't take action in our heads.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So that is a part of our amygdala, our animal brain that is programmed to keep us away from those feelings of fear. And you'll notice if you go next to the river, you go to the edge of the building, you step back a few feet automatically without even thinking about it. It's because below the animal brain is the launch pad for higher intellectual consciousness. So it has way more control than we even realize. It does stuff without us being able to be aware of it. So that's why you take a few steps back and then you're like, ooh, this is scary. And you don't even notice that you took a few steps back. Um, so this process happens not only in the physical world, but also in the intellectual and emotional world. So
Yes.
whenever we go towards creating this new thing, we go into the unknown growth space where, ultimately it's where abundance lives. That an inspiration is us walking over to the edge of the building, and the barrier is the fear. Because whenever we, even our egos or our, other aspects of ourselves, whenever we extend ourselves into a place in which we are vulnerable in our lives, that could be, I'm new at creating a podcast. I'm new at trying to write this book. We become vulnerable, not just to the world, because what we share, the creative thing we make, then other people can see it and we can be judged, but also to ourselves, because our deep egoic sense of self and the way that we identify who we are in the world immediately becomes challenged once we step into the creative space or some space of the unknown, because we have a story in our mind about how capable we are, about how we're better than the next person probably, and how we can do this and this and this, and we're rooted in that sense of self. But whenever we go to create the podcast and you get 2 listens, that sense of ego and egoic strength is then challenged, and we really don't like feeling that. So those are types of vulnerability that present themselves whenever we move into the unknown growth space. But once we recognize that process, that it's just an illusion, it's not an actual threat to us. And you keep this in mind and you begin building the patterns of whenever you try and extend yourself into a new area, you can recognize this process unfolding. So, and by recognizing it, you shine light on it. And by shining light on it, it becomes exposed for what it really is.
Yeah.
It's your body just trying to protect you and keep you from being vulnerable. But that's whenever you reintroduce the mind and you remind yourself, like, I am alive one time right now. And I'm going to choose that more is possible for me, that I deserve more than living in this safe little insulated space. I'm going to move into that space, into something unknown. I'm going to explore, understand myself. I'm going to try, and I'm going to trust that I will figure out what happens. And even if you aren't successful in whatever it is that you're trying to do, there is great wisdom learned in moving through that process. And you can teach yourself to then, just by following that same pattern again and again, continue to move into the unknown. And the thing is like, the first thing that you try whenever you're moving in that space, it probably won't be successful, because most things aren't successful. That's another thing that people tend to like. Another issue that holds people back is like, all we see in life are the successes of others. You
Mhm.
see, you know, like,
You.
I don't know, just yeah, yeah. Thank you. Well,
No,
but and
it's true.
you didn't see the 12 different book ideas I wrote before this one worked, like that I
Yes.
was like, that maybe this, maybe that, maybe this. You think about someone like, and this is a total random pull, but someone
Yeah.
like Elton John, who he
Okay.
has, he's put out, and I bring him up because he's crazy. I don't think people recognize how prolific he is. He's put out like an album a year for like
Wow.
40 years. I mean, he's like an
Wow.
absurd amount of records. But which ones can you name? Like Yellow Brick Road? I don't know any other ones, it's like, but he's still a legend in our mind. And so that's kind of how this works. And so the idea that we don't see the things that didn't work, we only see the successes of others, because that's what breaks through the static, makes
Yes.
us feel, that like, oh, well, everything we do should be successful. And it's like my perception of that is that those things we go to work on that don't work out are part of the success. It's because going through that process, we understand a bit more how the process works. We understand something about ourselves. We also understand what doesn't work, which is really useful because we're okay,
Mm.
well, I tried this, that didn't work out. Good to know. Let's now move on again to the next thing. And it's through the excavation of your own path like that that you arrive at a at something that is successful that
Yes.
you hadn't been able to consider as an option before because you had to go through the other things to get to that realization. And that's how it always works out.
Okay, this is so good. And again, so much I want to dive into with what you said. How important is intentionality around starting something? Because I think it's important to realize you're right. A lot of people aren't successful with a lot of the things. You said you had 12 ideas and then you landed on this one. And I just wonder though, because, with a lot of the entrepreneurs that I've interviewed, it seems like they had a very clear vision and a big vision, right? They say, like, I think you even wrote about this in the book, but if you want to, hit the top of the mountain, you got to aim higher. That's not the right,
Yeah.
exactly how it's said or whatever. You got to shoot for the moon to land on the top. And I think a lot of the people that I've seen who've been successful, it doesn't mean that they didn't have failures or challenges, but they did seem to have a very clear, big dream that they were putting out there. Is that important? Or like to speak on that? I'm just curious, like, just from your own experience, how you approach it.
Yeah, it can be important. I think that it works in a couple of different ways. One, it's really good to set like attainable goals. So it's good to, if you want to start a podcast, like, I mean, ultimately with anything that you do, consistency is really the key to success.
Yes.
And so if you want to start a podcast, it's like, great, show up for it because like genius, I think about this in the studio, like whenever I used to compose music all the time. And I think about this with writing. It's like, genius or the great ideas, they will come, but it takes time. And you have to so make yourself available for them to arrive, right?
Yes.
So if
Yep.
you're like, well, I'm going to write once a month or once a week on every Saturday morning, well, fine, but it's going to take 20 times longer than if you write every morning because eventually like the great things will come, but you've given that space, you've created the space for there to be more opportunity. That's why consistency is so important in whatever you're doing.
Yes.
Also your brain gets into like your neuroplasticity changes and the framework of your consciousness shifts where you start like living and breathing the whatever it is that you're doing, and that's how you become. That's like why a chef is so incredible. It's because they're like all they think about. They're in the
Yeah.
world of chefiness,
Yes.
all
Chefiness.
the
I like
time.
that.
So the small things are it's good to in terms of just getting in there and doing something and creating.
Yes.
The big visions are important because I mean everyone I know and in myself, you have a big vision, but I think a part of having the big like clear intentional idea is also knowing that it's going to change along the way. It's
Yes.
really important because you can't ever know what you don't know until you know it. And so you have an idea of how something's going to unfold, and in the process of getting there, new information comes to light. You understand and think about what it is differently, and you must change it. Like the thing must evolve. And like I used to use this metaphor. I don't know how successfully. We'll find out. I'm gonna try it again. So like I think it might be a little abstract, but like you have an idea that's in your mind and it's really exciting. When you put it out into the world, it becomes a collaboration with like the world in quotes and you. it ceases to just be the thing in your mind anymore. And that really hangs creative people up or entrepreneurs up because you go, no, no, I had this idea. This is what it's going to be. But it simply can't be that way because, like water pouring into a glass, whenever you put your idea into the world, it takes shape through the physicality of things and other people and the co-creation of, like what's happening in culture. The idea is going to shift because it's living outside of your mind. And a lot of people don't like that. And they look at it as an excuse to stop because they're like, well, this isn't really working how I thought. Well, of course it isn't because it's in the world. So now it's how
Yes.
partially how you think, and now you're like midwifing this idea into reality
Beautiful.
as opposed
Yes.
to being like, oh, this is me in the world. And so that understanding is like that, okay, so all things change and beautiful. And you can still your fingerprints is still over it, but you just have to change it as you understand more things. Um, so that's really important in terms of like big goals, I think. But I also think that it's really important to dream way bigger than you possibly can imagine. Like, don't, that's one of the things like where I used to do this all the time. And I think whenever I stopped doing it, it really made a big difference. Is I used to think like, well, you know, it would be cool to do this, but like whatever the thing is, but I wouldn't let myself dream big. I was like surviving instead of thriving. And for example, like, and I kind of, one of the things that I think made me realize that and start to believe a bit differently was with my first book, like it came out in 2019 and I'd always wanted to write a book, but I'd never actually tried. And I just randomly had a literary agent. Like I felt it was time, and this literary agent appeared out of nowhere and said, "Hey, you ever thought about writing a book? Do you have representation?" I said, uh, "Yes and no. I don't have representation." So they're okay. Well, try writing a book proposal. And I was like, "Well, this could be cool. Like maybe Shambhala or Sounds True or someone would buy it. That would be wild to have a book through them." So I wrote this little proposal, never having written before. Like in 2 weeks, I wrote this proposal. I gave it to my agent, and she's like, okay. And like a week later, she's like, okay, we have meetings with the big five, with Penguin Random House, with Simon Schuster, with
Wow. I just
Harper,
got
etc.
goosebumps. Yeah, that's awesome. I did. I just
And
got goosebumps. Yeah.
amazing. And I was like, wait, well, that escalated quickly. Okay. And then, I got to deal with Penguin Random House. And it's kind of like, in terms of music, it's like being a fan of music your whole life and then making like a demo in like 2 weeks. And then Capitol Records is like, here's a record deal, you know?
Right.
So I was like, oh, wow. All right. I like, interesting. So that kind of gave me objective feedback of like, the world is thinking more of me than I do, apparently. So I need to think bigger and really just try and think as much as have my aspirations be as high as possible. And I'll tell you like a funny story of how that worked out. It continues to work. It's like, I just think of like, okay, how can I step right into first place essentially with anything? Like, what's the maximum level? And let's just try and make that happen. And if it doesn't happen, like you were saying, it's fine. You still do something good, but you might as well try and just step right in line and,
Yeah.
do
Go
the
for
big
it.
thing.
Yeah. Swing,
Um,
swing for out of the ballpark, right? Why are you going for
Absolutely.
first base when you could maybe get a home run?
Totally,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so a quick little story of like one way that's transpired for me was, and I'm sharing this because it's like the thought process. I don't want to just say like think big. Like here's the thought process.
Yes.
Um, like about a year ago, I was talking with some friends, some other authors, and we talked about doing some live theater shows of us just having conversations. Theaters of like 1,500 people doing it in a few different cities. And so, they were interested, and I thought, well, this would be cool. Like, yeah. And then, of course, we're all busy and everything, but I was like, I'll take care of it. I'll make this happen for us. And so I didn't know anybody. I didn't know like what to do. I've never booked a theater before or a theater tour. And so
Yeah.
I just thought, I sat back and I thought, all right, well, um, you know, first off, what's important? Like context and beauty is really important in the physical world. Where you experience something makes all the difference. And so I thought they need to be beautiful, like historical theaters, because that's going to create this element of kind of magic and connection for people that come to see like an intimate space with history opens the intimacy of oneself whenever they're trying to hear and connect with something that's, healing. And so I thought that, like, and this, sorry if this example is too weird for you, but like I was explaining this to someone, and I was like, you could watch a video of someone giving birth. But if someone gave birth on stage in front of 1,500 people, it's a whole different energy. you know, the energy is times like 1,000. And so that's how I was describing these talks. I'm like, you could hear someone talk on a podcast, but if you do it like that, it
Beautiful.
becomes this crazy thing.
Yeah.
So then I just thought I followed the breadcrumbs. It's like, all right, well, who do I know that does like the tours for a living? Well, I know a bunch of professional stand-up comedians. And so I thought I'll just text one of them. I said, "Hey, how does this work? Like, what do you do? How are you always on tour?" And he's like, "Well, I have a touring agent." And I was like, "Cool. Well, who are they?" And he was like, "Well, let me set up a meeting with them for you." I was like,
Yeah.
"Great." So I had a meeting with a person at the agency, and I told them the idea. And they're like, "I love this. I do club touring, but let me transfer you to the person that does like large theaters, and you can have a meeting with them." Like, okay, cool. So I talked to them. They were like, "I love this idea. Let's put it together, and let me get an offer from Live Nation. We'll make this happen." And I was like, "Great." And so then we ended up not doing these for other reasons, but the point is that um, that guy also who I was talking to was, I believe, the agency is like who represents Dave Chappelle. So it's like basically going from not knowing anyone to talking to the biggest mover in the entire industry, just like within the course of 2 weeks or something like that. And so it's that process of just thinking logically, stepping into the positions in which you get into with that level of confidence and clarity about what it is that you're doing. And things happen like that. It's like, but it's thinking of like, if I would have ever at point had the mindset of like, well, like, who am I? I don't know what I'm talking about. I've never done this. I won't be able to hang in these conversations. Then I would have been scared and I would have put it off and never set the meetings. But rather than that, I am familiar with myself. And so it's just sort of like um, that's the process of you can have an idea for something you want to do, but really just think about it as big as possible and just try to move right to whatever that thing is. And it's much, so much about, I think, growth and development and then also success is confidence, and it's being present in those moments and being able to know how to be flexible and adaptable to what you're in and the situation and the people. Also, being a nice person goes a long way too.
Yes.
Um, so that's like, how a person can, it's always really important to think big and then the second part of that is to not get scared or doubt yourself whenever you start getting invited to step into those big spaces that you dreamed of.
Absolutely. Well, let me ask you, because I'm wondering, what are you seeing is the biggest thing that holds people back? Because I think we all have those early wounds that leave a limiting belief, whether that's we're not worthy, we're not lovable as we are, we're not good enough. So if you've got that belief, and you talked about the importance of confidence, confidence probably comes from the doing and taking the action, but then you've got this old wound, which usually is attached to a much younger part of ourselves that does feel like it needs that love and protection. So how do we integrate that so we can take action?
That's a great question and I'll tell you just how I do it.
Please.
Because all of those things that you noted, I have all those things. I don't feel, lovable. I don't feel worthy. I don't feel like I bring any value. I don't feel, like also just going solely like down the line, like I don't feel attractive. I don't feel, like any of these things that people sometimes generally feel. It's all based off of my, childhood and the things I experienced whenever I was growing up with my parents. And so those thoughts are still inside of me. And I work with them kind of how I described at the beginning of this is whenever I built a hyper independence and self reliance, but also because of that was the good thing that came out of my younger years experience was relentless independence and self reliance, which creates it forced strength, it forced confidence, it forced this thing to like because whenever I was a kid, I was a very soft, shy, like I didn't talk to anyone until I was 4 years old, like very shy and enclosed like person and sensitive. And now, now look at me. I'm like I'm like this marble statue that came to life.
It's a
Um,
beautiful image. Yeah.
and so, what's interesting is that just from my own self inquiry, it's like that all of that character going from this creative, very hyper timid child to who I am now that was forged, So we think that like, oh, well, I'm just not this way. It's like, yeah, I was neither. Like this was like melted in the fire and created out of steel over my entire life. And so now whenever but we look at the process. So how did that happen? It's dealing with the things that you have to deal with, moving into those spaces and recognizing the story of the unlovableness, of the incapability, of the idea that you aren't worthy. Like it's all that is complete nonsense. It's all lies. It's all been impressed upon us. It hasn't been proven. Like where is it? Like that's what I would say. It's like if you're sitting there and you're going, well, I can't do this. Show me the proof, or if you're like, oh, I'm unlovable, go go tell your partner that that's the way you feel. Like, they love you. It's quite clear. Like look at reality. Step out of the story and look at the facts that you have. Like you are capable. You can do the thing. People do love you. You have worth. Look at what any person. Look back at what you've already done. Like you've kept yourself alive this entire time. That's a great success as an animal on this planet. Like that's huge. You've got it together. You have a place to live. Like you have you're sitting around thinking about this is the other big thing is like if you're sitting around thinking about how can you do more, that's an incredible breakthrough. It means that you have done enough in life to get to a place where you have time to be introspective. But also, the fact that you're thinking of that means that you still have the fire in your soul and that the belief is in there.
Mhm.
Because if you didn't have that, you wouldn't be thinking about that in the first place. So it's just a matter of letting it out, right? And so it's like whenever you have those limiting thoughts, the unlovable, the whatever, you use your mindful awareness. You recognize them as this is a story that I still have an attachment to because of my past experiences, because of things that happened to me.
Yes.
Now I choose this is why the mindfulness part is really important. In the present, you choose to take action and face in the face of those stories. And it can be something really small. And the more that you do that, you prove those stories wrong because you're like, yeah, I still feel that way, but I know what's really going on. Now look what I did this. Now I can go do this. Now I'll move towards this. Now I'll take steps to change this in my life. And you just keep repeating that. And it's through the acknowledgement, the acceptance, and the letting go of those negative mental narratives that arise and then taking action in the face of those things that you start building that confidence and that belief that ultimately over time will grow larger than because you just get receipts. You get like the more things you do, they're like, there's proof right there. Look what I did, like I'm accomplishing things that grows larger than those stories from childhood or from your past relationships or whatever. And then the one in control becomes the powerful, confident you full of self belief. And those limiting thoughts become the tiny thing that are easy to just step on and you often forgot about.
It's so beautiful. And it's also remembering the oneness. In your bio, It's Cory Allen is a wave of awareness that is currently floating in the middle of infinity. That was in your book. I love that. But that reminds us of our oneness. I mean, we're here for a reason and embracing that and, knowing that we have those wounds and you're just a beautiful example. And clearly you're lovable as you are without all the accomplishments. You don't need to have done what you've done, but you are allowing those gifts to work through you in spite of having those. And I think that's great because people can see, like, a lot of people don't admit that. They don't talk about that part. Cory, how can we reconnect to the play and the magic and the invitation of life to get on our path? Everyone's going to go out, get Brave New You. They're going to read the book. All the tools and resources are there. So many fun parts of it. I loved the part at the end where you talked about looking for those signs. I see those signs. We don't always act on them, but maybe that would be a nice place to, the end. You talked about, those outside portals that are kind of poking at us to pay attention.
Yeah, I love the portals. Yeah. And in terms of like inviting more fun and play into your life, I really think it's about, you know, paying attention to the things that you do. And it doesn't matter what they are. It really doesn't. Like the things you do that give you that little bit of like feeling of excitement, that lift you out of your seat, that give you the kind of like swirly feeling inside of you where you feel like you had like a giant cup of coffee or something, but it's like a cosmic cup of coffee, where you're like, I just got this blast of energy like this. And, the tragic thing is that a lot of people feel guilty about feeling that good.
Yeah.
So they're like, oh, I like to do this thing. It could be gardening, maybe it's podcasting, maybe it's painting. I don't know what it is, but they do a thing. It could be, I don't know, running, like whatever it is. They do a thing and they're like, oh, I love this so much. I better not do it too much because I'm guilty to feel that feeling all the time. It's like, you should be focusing on that feeling. And
Yes.
that's what I invite people to do is like, notice whenever they're doing anything, where they feel that little extra magic and that extra energy, and then make that a focal point of their lives. Do it more, build it in, make sure you're doing it. Like, why wouldn't you spend most of your time feeling that way if possible? You know,
Yes.
it's so do that. You do it more. And then in terms of the portals, I mean, this is just something I noticed over time that I think is really, really interesting to me is that like we have a sense of like what our skill sets are and like what our strengths are and what we enjoy. And every time that I have done something that has led to something valuable or successful, like in my professional life and also I suppose in personal life, it will be two aspects of myself that I'd never considered putting together and connecting, but something arises in life that is an invitation to connect these two things. And that's what I'll call the portal. It's like this opening that's like winking at you, that's asking, like, would you like to walk into this other reality, this other
Yes.
universe where you, and that's, the more I thought about that, the more I realized that that's how and why things like that are successful, why that process creates success is because the things that are successful don't exist yet. And that's why a lot of people don't create things that are successful. It's because they aren't paying attention. They're copying other people and they think, well, I can't do this because this isn't a model that exists. It's like, no, that's what you should do is the model that doesn't exist.
Yes.
And so by the connecting of the two elements of self, the two skills, the two thoughts, whatever that you never thought to connect, you create the new thing. And then if you are, have the self-trust to put it out into the world, then that's why it becomes important and successful is because it's like true originality.
Yes.
And it's fascinating to me is like even like whenever I started my podcast, for example, I was going on my friend's podcast who had a decent sized audience, and his listeners were like, they were hitting up my like music websites, like you should start a podcast, like, and then I thought like, well, all I do is talk to my friends about this stuff. Like that's what I just like talking about. I've got a studio full of audio gear and I know how to produce audio.
Right,
Like,
right.
let me put those things together and just try this podcast for fun. That was the whole thing. It was like for fun. And then 3 years later, the New York Times hit me up and was like, "Do you want to be on the front page of the Sunday Review?" And I was like, "Okay,
Unbelievable.
that sounds pretty good." So it's like you never know, but it's connecting those elements of self to create the thing is are the invitations of the portals.
It's beautiful. It's like the excavation was a word you used before, and you talked about yourself. The marble came to life.
Yeah.
These are beautiful.
Yes.
No, it's beautiful imagery, and I think what we're talking about is our intuition and our soul knowing. You have such a beautiful heart. Your writing is just it just enters the soul in a way that is so magical. I'm so grateful for the work that you do in the world. That you put this beautiful book out. Where should I direct people to find you? They should definitely, obviously, follow you on Instagram. But where else do you like to hang out?
Yeah, Instagram and Substack is another place where I hang out. I send out a free newsletter every 2 weeks, or I also have like a subscriber model where you can get it one every week, which they're generally a bit more juicy, of course. So over there on Substack and just that and Instagram, I think keep it clear, keep it focused and put a lot of energy into a few things and do them well, as opposed to try and be, all over the place. So those two places. And if you want to go to my website is cory-allen.com. My social is Hey Cory Allen on all platforms. And then if people want to go check out the book, they can go to bravenewubook.com and they can see various things there. Some endorsements from our friends like Young Pueblo and Nicola Pera and Vex King and Alexander Al. And they can learn more and get their own copy.
Yeah, everyone needs a copy of this book, truly. So I'll list all of those on the show notes, which is right on their podcast player, which is perfect. They can link right to it. Thank you for taking the time, Cory, to be here today. It's such a pleasure connecting with you and so grateful for the work that you do.
Of course. Thank you so much. This is really, really fun.
Thanks, Cory. Hey, friend, I have one request before we sign off today. If you've gained any value from any of the interviews that you've tuned into, would you take just 1 minute and leave a 5-star rating and review over on Apple Podcasts? It's actually how more women can find the show, and I want to continue growing a community of women who are loving themselves and living full on. So thank you for all of your support, and I look forward to being back with you next week. Bye for now.
This podcast is presented for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any information provided is not intended to be a substitute for medical, mental health, or other professional advice. Seek out your trusted healthcare provider or other qualified professional for all matters dealing with your health and well-being. Any opinions or information provided by a guest are their own and not those of Michele Lamoureux or the company.